For this video, what I want to do is walk you through solving linear equations that involve the distributive property. So sometimes when we have the distributive property, it can cause confusion as to what we want to do, so hopefully I can clear up that confusion for you. Let's get started. I do have two of them here. I'm going to walk through the first one with you, and then I encourage you to pause the video when we get to the second one, try it on your own, and then continue watching to see if you got the correct answer. Alright, so the first one that we have the equation 2 times the quantity 4 minus x plus 7 times the quantity 8 minus x equals 0. So remember, our goal is to get x completely by itself. In order to do that, what we have to do, since we have parentheses, is distribute this outside value into everything inside. When we distribute, we are just multiplying. If the sign here was negative, you would have to multiply by a negative because subtraction and negative signs are basically the same thing. Remember that subtraction is just adding a negative. So our next step would be to take and multiply 2 times 4, which would give us 8, minus 2 times x, plus 7 times 8, which is 56, minus 7 times x equals 0. So now it's just a matter of combining like terms. So we're going to combine our constant terms together. So we're going to add the 8 and the 56, which is going to give us 64. And we're going to combine our x terms together. So I would do the negative 2x and the negative 7. Since they have the same sign, same means sum, so I'm really just adding 2 plus 7 and keeping the sign. So 2 plus 7 would give us 9, and we would be left with negative 9x equals 0. At this point, it's a matter of preference as to whether or not you want to move the 64 or the x. You can move either term and you will get the same answer. It's just a matter of what's easiest for you to see. I personally try to move anything with negatives just because of the fact that it makes it easier. So I'm going to bring the negative 9x to the opposite side by doing the opposite. Okay, so the opposite of negative 9 would give us positive 9. So I'm really just adding 9x to 0, which would give us 9x. I could have just as easily moved the 64 over and it would have given us negative 64, but then we have to deal with dividing by negatives, and that oftentimes I find causes more confusion and students get the wrong answer. Alright, so when we look at this, we now end up with x equals 64 over 9. So depending upon the course that you're in some courses they're going to ask you to leave it as an unreduced fraction, so you would just enter it in as 64 divided by 9. That is a perfectly acceptable answer. Okay, it may want it as a mixed number, so you could figure out 64 divided by 9 is 7 with a remainder of 1. So this is another acceptable format of writing this answer. Or you could write it as a decimal. The thing with this is that when you do a decimal, it's an approximation, so it's not exact. On this one, it ends up being 7.1 repeated for forever, so you could write it as 7.1 with a line over it. It's just a matter of preference. A lot of times, if you're working in an online platform for entering your homework, they will either tell you to round or leave it as an exact answer. This would be considered an exact answer. This is an exact answer. And this would be an approximate answer. Okay, so depending upon the platform that you're using, there are different ways of writing the answer, all of which are acceptable depending upon the circumstances. Anytime you are solving equations, I recommend plugging it back in to see if it makes sense. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and show the work for checking this. When you are checking, a lot of times I tell my students, hey, just throw it into your calculator and see if it makes sense. Sometimes when you get a fraction answer like this, you get to the end and you think, I must have made a mistake because that's not an acceptable answer. Well, fractions are completely acceptable in the real world, so it is okay to get a fraction or a decimal answer. So let's check this out. I am going to show all the work. Like I said, you could just plug into your calculator 2 parentheses 4 minus 64 divided by 9, close your parenthesis in your calculator, plus 7 times 8 minus 64 divided by 9, and then set this equal to 0. So if you wanted to, you could have put just this part right here into your calculator, and when you hit enter, if it gives you 0, then you know you have the correct answer. Because I want to show you how to do this without the work, you could either distribute the 2 first, or you can simplify what's inside. Both will give you the same answer. I'm going to go ahead and just simplify what's inside each of the parentheses and see if it works out. Okay, so 4, if you think about it in terms of ninths, 4 times 9 is 36. So this is really 36 ninths minus 64 ninths. Plus 7 times 8 times 9 is 72. So we could think about 8 as really as 72 ninths minus 64 ninths. And we want to see, does this equal 0? Okay, so if I simplify what is inside here, the 36 minus 64 is going to give us negative 28 over 9. And I wrote 58, I don't know why. Negative 28 over 9 plus 72 minus 64 ends up giving us 8 over 9. And we're going to see, does this give us 0? Again, this one would have been a lot faster if you would have thrown it into a calculator, but it's also important to know how to do the math without the calculator. So 2 times negative 28 does give us negative 56 over 9. And 7 times 8 gives us positive 56 over 9. And so since these are the same numbers, they do end up canceling out, and we can see that 0 equals 0. So our answer was verified, and we know that it is correct. If you have a test with equations, you should never get anything but 100, because you can always check to see if your work is correct, even by plugging it into a calculator and seeing, does it give me the correct answer? Be careful about entering it into your calculator. I find a lot of students plug it into their calculator wrong, and the calculator does the order of operations it's programmed to, and that's not what you entered. So be very, very careful if you are relying on a calculator. All right, so like I said at the beginning of the video, I do have a second one. If I were you, I would go ahead and pause the video, try this one on your own first, see if you can do it on your own, and then continue watching to see if you got the correct answer. If you want to, you can just continue watching. All right, so what we would do first is take and distribute our 3 into our parentheses. On the second one, we are going to distribute a negative 3 into the parentheses. You do want to be careful with that anytime you see a subtraction, it does go to the value behind it and it counts as a sign. So make sure that you distribute the negative 3. When you do that, we end up with 3x minus 6 because we're just multiplying. Negative 3 times 5 gives me negative 15. Negative 3 times negative x ends up giving me positive 3x because I'm doing a negative times a negative, so be watching for that, equals 27. Okay, and then if we simplify, combine our like terms, 3x plus 3x gives me 6x. Negative 6 minus 15, since again they are the same, anytime they are the same, you sum them and keep the sign. So 6 plus 15 is 21, so we would write minus 21 equals 27. Okay, and again, there's multiple ways that you can do this. Since my variable term, the coefficient, is positive, I'm just going to leave it on the sign that it is on, and I'm going to move the negative 21 to the opposite side by adding 21. You really don't have to show this step. You could do this in your head. Just be careful when you're doing stuff in your head that you don't make mistakes, especially if they're opposite signs. So we end up with 6x equals 48. And then if I divide both sides by 6, we end up with x equals 8. So this one did give us a whole number for our answer. Again, I would just go back and check to make sure, does your answer make sense? This one will be a lot easier to check. I'm just going to write it down. A lot of times when you're checking, you can skip steps, but when I'm instructing, I always go through every step that I do. So I would have 8 minus 2 minus 3 times 5 minus 8 equals 27. I'm going to simplify what's inside the parentheses rather than distributing just because it's simpler, but you could do it that way as well. So I would end up with 3 times 6 minus 3 times negative 3 equals 27. Since these are different signs, I have a positive and a negative. Whenever you are doing that, you're subtracting and keeping the sign of the larger absolute value term. So 8 minus 5 would give me 3. Since the 8 is larger, I would have a negative. 3 times 6 gives me 18, plus 9 equals 27, and we can see that that is true. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If there are additional topics you would like me to cover, please let me know that as well.